this program featuring Professor Ricardo Hausmann. The topic is how the region is coping with the COVID-19 challenge. First, let me give you a bit of background. The Andean American Associations are the Venezuelan, Colombian, Ecuadorian, and Peruvian American Associations. We are the first chambers of commerce for this region in the US, and together we have hosted at least 1,000 programs over a period of more than 90 years. Today's event is in partnership with the US-Paraguay Chamber of Commerce. I would like to welcome Ana Julia Qatar, President of the Venezuelan American Association, Stephanie Junger Moat, President of the Colombian American Association, Juana Caicedo Selinger, President of the Ecuadorian American Association, and Maria Rosa Baquerizo, CEO of the Andean American Association. You have seen the impressive bio of our guest today. Just some highlights. Professor Ricardo Hausmann is director of the Growth Lab at Harvard Center for International Development and the Rafiq Hariri Professor of the Practice of International Political Economy at Harvard Kennedy School. Previously, he served as director of the Center for International Development. He was the first chief economist at the Inter-American Development Bank, where he created the research department. Now, long ago, in better times in Venezuela, he was Minister of Planning, a member of the board of the Central Bank of Venezuela, and professor of economics at the Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Administración in Caracas, where he founded the Center for Public Policy. His research interests include issues of growth, macroeconomic stability, international finance, and the social dimensions of development. He holds a PhD in economics from Cornell University. I am Michael Skol, the Vice President of the Venezuelan American Association. Now, to the main event. During and after our conversation, anyone can ask questions, which Professor will answer after we're finished here. Now, Professor Ricardo, thank you very much for being with us. Let's start with the pandemic itself down there. What's going on?
Well, it didn't start so serious, but it's getting really serious. Let me maybe, first of all, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for this invitation. Thank all of the Andean Chambers of Commerce for this opportunity to have this discussion. I think these are really important times, and we should all be discussing the challenges ahead. I'm going to share my screen for a little while, and so that we understand sort of like the dynamics of a pandemic of this kind. You have a population that is all susceptible. Say in November, nobody had seen this virus before, so everybody could get sick. Then over time, some people get infected. Of those that get infected, they tend to infect other people. How many other people are infected by each infected person is something we call the R factor. This R factor is going to be very important for what happens next. And then after a few weeks, the infected, most of them recover. Unfortunately, an unknown percentage of them die. It's unknown. The percentage is unknown in part because we don't really know how many people got infected. We only have confirmed cases. And we don't know really how many people die of coronavirus. We only have confirmed deaths of coronavirus. So there's a lot of uncertainty over these things. But in principle, the great majority of the people recover, and supposedly they develop immunity. So what happens over time is that everybody starts susceptible. That's the green line. Then some people start getting infected. This is the red line. As people start getting infected, and recovered, the virus has more and more trouble finding hosts because it jumps from one person to the other, but the other person already has immunity, so they cannot grow there. So eventually, this sort of like tends to cause the pandemic to die down. And at the end of the pandemic, as you see here, something like 80+% of the people got sick and recovered. Okay, so and that's what sort of like kills it, because then every time, you know, the virus jumps from one infected person to another person, that person happens to have immunity, and the virus cannot grow there. So those are more or less the dynamics in general of what we should expect. And a little bit of the discussion has been, if you don't do anything, you get this big peak that will overwhelm, say, the capacity of this healthcare system. So this is time, and this is the number of people infected. And if you adopt sort of like policies to slow down the spread, social distancing, lockdowns, and so on, in principle, you can flatten the curve, as they say. But notice that as you flatten the curve, what you do is you move out this peak from here, say, to there. So you make, in some sense, the crisis longer, but you don't change that much the area under the curve. The area under the curve is how many people get infected in total, not at the same time, but in total. So actually, for our factors that are, you know, more or less in line with this disease, the disease won't stop until, say, a fraction between 80 and 95% of the people get immunity. Okay. Now, interestingly, there are two ways of getting immunity. One way of getting immunity is by getting sick and recovering. The other way of getting immunity is by getting vaccinated. The only little problem is that the vaccine does not exist. Now, we are not certain when a vaccine will exist and how quickly we'll be able to vaccinate people. So this is important because there is a scenario in which we cannot stop it and 80+% of people will get sick, or there's a scenario in which we can hold it at bay until the majority of the people can get vaccinated. And that's a strategic decision going forward. And not all countries are in the same position to abide by it. So let me show you a little bit what the disease looks like up to date. These are cumulative deaths as of June 15th, so relatively recently. So you know, the countries that have seen more deaths per million inhabitants are Belgium, Great Britain, France, Italy, Spain, Sweden, France, the US, Ireland. I don't know what this is. This is Switzerland. And then at the same level of Switzerland, you get our countries here, which are Ecuador, Brazil, Peru, Chile, Mexico. And then you see a bunch of others down there. So up to now, the disease has been, to a large extent, dominant in rich countries. Rich countries are more connected to the world, so they got more infected people faster, quicker, and they got sick earlier, okay? So Latin America, in some sense, is not doing that bad in terms of total deaths. And this is the countries in the call and a few others. You see it's Ecuador, Peru, Brazil are, and Chile are at the top, followed by Mexico. And then way behind, Colombia, Argentina, and Paraguay. So that's where we are, but that's not the current dynamics. If you ask here, what I'm putting here is, what was your maximum 7-day average death rate per million? And what is your current death rate per million? So if you look at all the countries in the world, the maximum is Belgium, Spain, France, Italy, Ireland, and so on. But the current daily death rates, the top one is Chile, followed by Peru, Mexico, Brazil, right? So currently, the number of daily death rates, not cumulative as I showed you before, but daily, Latin America is leading the world. Latin America is leading the world. So it's not in cumulative. In cumulative, you know, it's Belgium, Spain, and so on. But in terms of new infections, Latin America is leading the world. And let me explain a little bit why the dynamics have been so different. Here I'm going to compare Italy to the US. So that we get in Italy, we all know was, you know, really a big, nasty peak. So the death rates, so let me start with mobility. I have here Google data on mobility to the workplace, okay? So how many people stopped going to the workplace? And, you know, that number went up to 70% in Italy. Much much less mobility decline in the US. That's the orange line here, okay? Now, Italy had a really nasty peak, and then it came down really, really fast. So the US had a much narrower and more delayed peak, but it has been coming down much more slowly. So right now, there are more deaths per million, significantly more deaths per million in the US than in Italy, okay? But essentially what you have is the disease is coming, they put a lockdown. The lockdown, obviously, you know, people take about 18 days on average between getting infected and dying. So if you put the lockdown, for the subsequent 17 days, people who got infected before the lockdown will still be dying, right? And you will only start seeing the decline in deaths, supposing that the lockdown is super effective, after, say, 17, 20 days. And that's what you see in Italy. The US had a much less severe lockdown, and you see that the peak came later, and the decline has been much slower in the US. So that's just for us to understand what's the picture in the US and in Europe and so on. So let's now compare, say, the US to Peru, okay? So Peru had a much tougher lockdown than the US. Much tougher lockdown. And as a consequence, the US had this big death peak that did not happen in Peru. And in Peru, you know, the lockdown has been fairly severe. It tends to go down over time, right? But still much more lockdown than in the US. But now what you find is that in Peru, in spite of the lockdown, you get this exponential growth in daily cases. So in spite of the fact that Peru has had a more severe lockdown, while maybe at the beginning it was effective in slowing things down, today it's not effective at keeping the thing under control, because this R factor that I mentioned below is above 1. When it's above 1, it leads to this exponential growth, and that's what we are seeing in Peru. Okay, so that was Peru. So now I'm going to compare Peru to other Latin American countries. So notice that, and let me go back. Notice you put a lockdown in Italy, you get a peak, and then the death rate starts coming down. And as it comes down, Italy is able to release the lockdown. So you see the death rates keep on coming down as Italy opens up. The problem in Peru, right, is that they want to open up, they're tired of the lockdown, but the death rate has not increased, has kept on going up, and now it's higher than in the US. So that's the death rate in Peru. This is the death rate in the US as of last week. So if we now compare Peru to Colombia, they both locked down very significantly. Peru tougher than Colombia, and Colombia is sort of like opening up faster de facto. But here you have death rates in Peru and death rates in Colombia. They're both growing. Peru much faster than Colombia, but the trends are not good. Okay, so Colombia is also tired of the lockdown, but death rates are growing. And so now they face the trade-off of opening up while the death rate is coming down. This is Peru versus Chile. Chile had, again, a less severe lockdown than Peru. And Peru has this death rate, but something happened recently in Chile that Chile has had this spectacular explosion of death rates. And that's one reason why Chile is now shutting down again, okay? This is Peru versus Ecuador. Again, they all shut down very similarly. Ecuador has been opening up faster than Peru. Ecuador had these nasty peaks here in Guayaquil and so on, where you saw these very, very nasty peaks. Also, this must be poor reporting of death rate data. But now Ecuador has seen a big decline in death rates. So now Peru has much higher death rates than Ecuador. And this is Peru versus Brazil. So Brazil had much less of a lockdown. Bolsonaro was not encouraging people to lock down or to wear masks and so on. But governors de facto asked people to lock down. So the lockdown in Brazil is less severe than in Peru. But now they track each other on death rate. So they both have explosive growth deaths going forward. So that's what's happening. Let me summarize it the following way, if you want. Latin America was quick at imposing lockdowns in general. It, those lockdowns appear to be working at the beginning. In most countries, they have lost their effectiveness. Now, in spite of formal lockdowns, you see exponential growth. And now the region is facing a really tough situation because it cannot keep on locking people down because the economy, as we probably will discuss, it suffers a lot and people are suffering a lot. On the other hand, if they open up, they will only aggravate what's already explosive growth in death rates.
Ricardo, I understand that the situation is in Venezuela, as far as the pandemic is concerned, is something of a surprise. Tell us about what's going on there.
Well, yes. As you know, let me see if I have it here. Yes, let me share again my screen for a second. So Venezuela has very odd data. So these are deaths per million. They're very low by, say, Peruvian standards. They're even low by Colombian standards. This is the lockdown. So the lockdown was very severe. It's losing its effectiveness. And right now you see that the lockdown has lost a bit of its effectiveness, and you saw this peak in death rates. So the way I would characterize Venezuela is that Venezuela was in a catastrophic situation before COVID-19. Before COVID-19, Venezuela had lost 70% of its GDP. It has lost something like 75% of its oil output. It had gone through the biggest hyperinflation in Latin American history. It had lost 5 million people to outmigration, refugees in the rest of the continent and the world. And then two things happened. The first one is a severe shortage of gasoline, which has meant that mobility has declined very significantly. So it's really, really hard to move around in Venezuela. And all of these things, in some sense, if you want, protected Venezuela from the virus, because there were very few international travelers going into Venezuela. There were very few flights into Venezuela, and before the lockdown. So, and there's very little mobility within Venezuela. So Venezuela has had probably a delayed start of the infection. But right now, I would say that the cost of the lockdown is gigantic in the context of a country that was already so damaged. Okay, and the current trend suggests that Venezuela will probably have a similar pattern of infection, but with some delay. So what essentially has happened is that the distancing of the country from the rest of the world and the low levels of gasoline in the country and so on, and the low levels of mobility have caused the virus to have a harder time diffusing into the population. But I think the check is in the mail, unfortunately.
Okay, let's, Ricardo, let's turn to the economic impact of the pandemic. You've referred to it, but that's your real area of expertise. I'd like to hear what your description of what's happening and what will happen.
Okay, so I think that there are two things that we have learned that we did not know in March. Okay, the first thing that we have learned is that lockdowns are much more expensive economically than we thought. Two numbers have come out, one from Colombia, one from Peru. In Colombia, they documented that in the quarter of February, March, and April, they lost 5 million jobs relative to last year. That's a gigantic amount of job losses. Unemployment is above 20% in Colombia. In Peru, April versus April, they lost like 45% of the jobs. So so there's been a devastation of people's insertion into the labor market. The expectation is for second quarter GDP in Peru to have fallen by something like 40%. World Bank just announced that they expect double-digit negative GDP growth for the year for Peru. I've seen some projections that I find extremely optimistic for Colombia of 8% declines in GDP. I think Colombia will be in double digits. So the first thing we learn is that these lockdowns are incredibly costly in terms of output, employment, especially employment. The second thing that we're learning is that they're not that effective. That in spite of very severe lockdowns, you cannot stop this exponential growth of cases and deaths. So obviously, we don't know the counterfactual, what would have been the rate of infection and what would have been the rate of deaths had the lockdowns not been in place. But we did not see pictures like what we've seen in Italy or in Israel. Israel went from, 700 infections a day to 7 infections a day. I'm working, helping 12 countries figure things out. And I can report that countries like Jordan or Namibia, they haven't had a death in the since the month of May. And they brought their cases down and so on. So these things have worked in some places. They haven't been working as well in places like Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, and so on. Brazil, you can say that they didn't really impose these severe lockdowns, and consequently they have these explosive growth. But in places that are the opposite of Bolsonaro, where they really took it seriously, they have had trouble slowing things down. So I think that it may be that in the second semester, Latin America will look a bit more like Massachusetts. I'm here in Massachusetts, okay? Massachusetts is a state of 6.8 million people.
That doesn't look like Boston in the back of you, though.
No, man, these are the Berkshires. These are the beautiful Berkshires. So we've been hibernating here for the last 3 months. But in Massachusetts, 6.8 million people, we have about 7,700 deaths. That means we have
1 moment.
We have the same number of in Colombia. Colombia has 6 times the population of the Berkshires and has 1,100 deaths. So Colombia is at a 50th of the deaths per million as Massachusetts. So I think that, unfortunately, the trends are for the number of deaths per million to go up significantly in the second semester, and that countries are going to be facing a really, really daunting set of horrible trade-offs between, a really very impacted economy at the same time when the disease is not contained. And with a government that has been weakened. At the beginning of the pandemic, countries looked, in good shape macroeconomically, and they thought that they could afford a 45-day lockdown, eventually a 90-day lockdown. They thought that after the lockdown came the recovery. Now they're realizing that after the lockdown, the disease is still around. Maybe less than 10% of the people have gotten infected. I told you that you need 80+% of the people recovered for the disease to be sort of behind us and disappear. That's not going to happen anytime soon. So they will have restricted economic activity, closed borders, restricted travel, restricted activities in restaurants and sports events, maybe universities. We've been told that we're not going to be teaching in the classroom at Harvard in the second semester, in the fall term. So it's a period in which GDP is significantly constrained by social distancing measures. Now, up to now, the disease has meant that not only GDP and employment has fallen like a stone, but tax revenues have fallen like a stone, even faster than GDP. So governments have had to announce that they're in a borrowing spree to try to maintain government spending, increase government spending in healthcare and epidemiological activities. And capital markets have been not terribly happy about the new fiscal situation. Rating agencies have been downgrading country after country. This is the biggest peak in downgrades in history. And so we face a situation where the governments will be more constrained financially in the second semester than they were at the beginning of the pandemic, at the time when they may be losing control of the disease. So I think that the second semester is going to be really, really tough for Latin America.
What should governments be doing right now? How, and will they do it?
Well, I think there are three things that they need to be focused on. The first thing that they need to be focused on is learning about managing the epidemiological side of the disease. You correctly said that that's not my area of expertise, but to tell you the truth, that is nobody's area of expertise, because this is a new disease, and you know it transmits itself in very different ways from, say, AIDS, right? That, you know, we knew what was the transmission mechanism, so you can interfere with that transmission mechanism. But here, you know, we don't know if asymptomatic people are contagious and how contagious are they. We don't know where in Peru or in Colombia or in Chile people are getting infected. Are they getting infected in the transportation system? Are they getting infected at home? Are they getting infected at work? Are they getting infected in the supermarkets or whatever? So we don't know where to try to act so as to minimize infections, doing the least possible harm to the economy. So we need to establish fast feedback loops between what is happening with the disease and what are the policy lessons from it. Let me give you two examples. In two of the countries that I work on, in Jordan, or three, in Jordan, they got the disease really, really under control. Incredible, fantastic, really top notch. So they started opening up, and suddenly they realized that there was a hotspot of contagion in Irbid, a secondary city in Jordan. They investigated and found out that it was two truck drivers that came in from Saudi Arabia infected. They went to their homes, embraced everybody in the family, and they got everybody infected. So they identified, they stopped it, they closed the border, they changed the protocols at the border, and that's how they regained control of the disease. But that requires these fast feedback loops between what happens and the policy response. We are not having that in Latin America. Everybody is guessing that it is because of the informal sector, the people who cannot afford to stay home, that they have to go out to work, and that is the reason why we see these infections.
Excuse me, are we having that in the U.S.?
Well, no. I think part of the idea is that if the lockdown is successful, as it was in Israel, as it was in Uruguay, as it was in Belize, then you get cases so low that the system is able to try to trace the contacts of the people infected and figure out where they might have gotten infected, and have the feedback loop to policy of closing it down. So we haven't had it. That's why Massachusetts has been a basket case. I mean, with Harvard, MIT, with all, you know, with Massachusetts General Hospital and all of these extremely advanced things, we are highly connected to the world. So it's very easy for us to get a lot of people from outside of town infecting us. And so we haven't been able to gain control of it. So Latin America has to learn to do more effective social distancing. That's task number one. Task number two, if you want people, I think that the goals of policy is to it's not to maximize GDP this year or next. It's to minimize the long-term damage to people and to firms that this disease is going to do. So we need to figure out ways to support people throughout the pandemic and ways to minimize unnecessary bankruptcies during the pandemic. And that implies a set of policies of social support, of business support, that we need to be able to figure out how to make them happen. For example, on social support, Latin America can leverage its system of social transfers, and it has. On business support, we have been less effective. We've been giving credit guarantees to the banking system to encourage the banking system to keep on lending. I think it's maybe too soon to tell, but my impression is that in many countries, there's been very little take-up on those credit guarantees. So banks don't want them because they're partial guarantees and they don't want to keep on the remaining risk in their books. Or number two, they've been able to substitute guaranteed loans for unguaranteed loans. So they have been protecting themselves, but not really extending additional credit. So we need to figure out how to help the economy, but to do that, you need a government that can mobilize resources. So the third task is to create as much fiscal space as possible so that the government has, if you want, the fuel with which to do these things. The way, say, the US has done. The US has already spent $3 trillion in helping the economy. $3 trillion is what is it? GDP is about 20 trillion, so it's 15% of GDP.
Well, as Cecil B. DeMille said, a trillion here and a trillion there, eventually you're talking about real money.
Exactly. So that's something that the US can do. Doing a similar thing in Latin America is probably unfeasible, but doing something of that order of magnitude is what countries need to try to achieve. And that is easier done in countries that started with very, very solid macro like Peru and Chile. It's something that's completely out of the question in countries like Ecuador. Ecuador is already in default, and Ecuador is, say, wholly dependent on official finance. They're trying to get themselves $10 billion of international finance to help the economy along in this very complicated period. And I think we have to do as much as we can to make sure that they get it. It's really important that they do. So those three things, a better epidemiological strategy, programs to support people and firms throughout this crisis, and the fiscal space, the financial muscle to be able to fund these things.
Well, will these governments do it, is the question. Are they capable of doing it? Will they do it? Will a Brazil do it? Will a Mexico do it?
Well, let's start with the countries on the call. So I think that Peru is best positioned to do it. Paraguay is well positioned to do it. They went to market, placed a bond in the middle of the pandemic. Peru went to market, placed a bond at 2.75% interest. And they're trying to do it. So Peru, Colombia has less margin. They're being downgraded, probably below investment grade. They're afraid of that. They feel that they don't have that much fiscal space, so they're more cautious. They've been less aggressive on supporting the economy, and that's why I was saying that we all started, many countries started thinking that this was more or less a 400-meter race. And it now looks increasingly like a 10,000-meter race or a marathon. So they were running very fast in the second quarter of this year. They cannot keep on running at that speed in the subsequent subsequent quarters until this thing is out of them. And so that's why I'm concerned that they will run out of this fiscal space, out of this policy space, out of this financial muscle before we are past this crisis. And that's going to force very, very nasty, tough decisions. But I think that, it's interesting. This pandemic has strengthened some governments. The president of Peru has an approval rating above 70%. The approval rating of President of Colombia has gone up, and and so on. In the case of Brazil and Mexico that you asked, Brazil is in a tougher financial situation. They already lost something like $50 billion of international reserves. They tried to accommodate with monetary policy, but that led to significant reserve losses. Their fiscal is looking very dicey, so I don't see them as having the wherewithal to do what other countries in the like the Perus and Chiles and to some extent the Colombias have done. Mexico is in a complicated situation. I don't think that they have articulated a coherent either epidemiological strategy or economic strategy. In principle, they inherited a relatively good macro situation, but AMLO has been amazingly apt at shooting himself in the foot, and I don't know how. I don't have a clear view as to how they plan to manage this thing macroeconomically going forward.
Okay, I can't resist before we go to questions to ask that you comment a little more generally on what's going on in Venezuela. I mentioned, and I knew you when you were in a real government in a real Venezuela, which was a real producer of oil. All that has changed in an historical catastrophe that is almost unique in peacetime world history. You have any more to add about how you feel the Venezuela situation is going? Not just the economy, but the politics, the security, the international relations.
I think that Venezuela is in the process of seeing an implosion of every dimension of society. That is, it's not only an implosion of oil. I think there were some numbers that I saw yesterday on oil production. It has gone down like a stone in the last month. And apparently they are shutting down production because they don't know what to do with the output. They cannot export it. They cannot refine it. All the refineries are stopped. They're trying to restart one refinery with enormous difficulty and haven't been able to produce anything of value from it. Agricultural production has collapsed because this year they had no seeds, no fertilizers, no agrochemicals, no spare parts for tractors, and so very, very little in terms of agricultural production. Food imports have collapsed. Medical imports have collapsed. They are at maybe 10% what they were in 2012. So what has helped is the fact that there are fewer people living in Venezuela, and those people were sending remittances to Venezuela. Well, now remittances have collapsed because Venezuelans abroad are also hurting from the disease, and they are in economies that are in recession. So that has been an additional shock. In spite of all of this, the Venezuelan opposition is not going through its best of times. It's probably going through some of its worst of times. So it's not that the political dynamics are in favor of a resolution. A resolution, it's very clear that Venezuela is essentially a brutal criminal dictatorship, and until the military and the police break ranks with the Maduro regime, it's hard for another force to turn the situation around. People have marched, people have protested, people have died, people are in jail, etc. There's just so much energy that you can ask for a society that's under so much turmoil and restriction. So right now, I think that we need some kind of an initiative, maybe an international initiative. The last one, which the US put out, of an emergency national government of national unity, that's been 3 months old, and It hasn't moved up. The government has just um, eh, eh, has just unilaterally appointed the judges of the electoral court and has just taken over the symbols of all the political parties and chosen some people they bought off from those parties to represent them. So they're really making a shamble of this whole potential electoral solution. I think that not only will the US, Canada, the Grupo de Lima, and condemn these actions, but they also have been condemned by the more moderate international contact group that is formed by Mexico, Uruguay, Spain, and so on. So I think the government is feeling that they can afford to be internationally isolated. I don't know how they plan to pay the bills. We saw some dimensions of breakdown of security order because they keep order not only with different police gangs, and they have this group called the FIES, which is probably the largest criminal group in the world these days. They kill people left and right with no consequences. Colectivos, these criminal organizations that are led by these people called pranes, and then you have the FARC dissidents and the ELN controlling parts of the country. So there is sort of like a tacit agreement of sharing power with these organizations. There are zones that in very, very Orwellian terms are called peace zones. And peace zones are areas where the regular army and police don't go in because they're controlled by allied paramilitary groups. And so that's the current situation of the country. I think that from a humanitarian point of view, the second semester of this year is going to be catastrophic. But the international community is a little bit more inward looking these days. They're fighting the pandemic within their borders, and they have little wherewithal to express themselves internationally. So it's going to be a really, really serious situation. I think that all the attention that we can garner on the issue of Venezuela is well deserved. I think that it requires much more focus and attention than it's been getting in these last couple of months.
Okay, let's turn to questions. Once again, if you have a question, just click the Q&A button, type your question in, and I will attempt to select some of them and read them. I've seen a couple now, which in fact, they were placed early in the conversation. In fact, Ricardo Hausmann has already answered these questions. So if I don't get to your question, it's because he knew you were going to ask it and he answered. But here's one. The lockdowns in Latin America countries were strict on paper, but informal workers never fully locked down. Will this be the reason for lockdowns not being effective in Latin America versus you saying that strict lockdowns were not effective to stop the infections in general?
So, the best answer, this is a very good and important question. It goes to a question of why have formally strict lockdowns not been as effective as we wish they had been. And the hypothesis going out, and that's embedded in the question is the idea that people who live on a day-to-day basis, they cannot stay home because they're facing some probability of infection and death if they leave home, and certainty of starving to death if they stay home. So in principle, that has been the hypothesis, that it's the informal sector that has not been effectively locked down. Now, if you wanted to make the informal sector lockdown, you may have had to compensate them more than you did. That is, if people in the US, for a significant chunk of the population, the unemployment compensation and the checks that the federal government have been sending them were higher than their wage. So actually, disposable income in the month of April went up, not down in the US because of this massive social support. We have been much stingier in terms of social support, and that might explain that logic. However, the numbers I showed to you about the intensity of lockdowns, these mobility numbers, they don't come from measures of the law. They come from Google measures of people mobilizing themselves to their place of work. And those numbers are way, way down, much, that is seen from Google. I would call that de facto lockdown. It has been more severe than in the US. Now, there are other issues at hand. For example, Hugo Ñopo, who's an excellent economist. He was for a good chunk of time at the IDB. He's now in Grade in Peru. He wrote an article saying that 50% of Peruvians don't have refrigerators. If they don't have refrigerators, they have to go very frequently to shop. And that means that they have to leave home to go to shop, and that may be the points of infection, right? So, but we don't know. These things are knowable. They are knowable, but you have to set yourself up to learn. And that's why I was saying that it's so important to create these rapid feedback loops between what we learn on the field and the policies. Some of the policies of lockdown were really probably very ill-conceived. For example, they restricted people to go from the time in which they can go out, but they made them go out all at the same time. So they created and they shortened the number of hours that shops could be open. So you had everybody in the shop at the same time, a lot of congestion in shops. That probably backfired. What you would have wanted to do is extend working hours of shops and lower the number of people who can go out at the same point in time. Like, for example, they did in Panama. In Panama, depending on the last number of your ID card and your gender, you can go out at certain moments of the day, certain days of the week. And that way they try to spread the number of people who are out of their homes so that the density of people in the streets and outside is lower, and they can achieve lower infections. It has worked better in Panama than in Peru and Colombia, not as well as in Costa Rica. Maybe because Panama, to begin with, was more connected to the world through, the airport at Tocumen and Copa and so on. But there are ways in which you can make lockdowns counterproductive and ways in which you can make lockdowns smarter. And we need to get to smarter social distancing very quickly if we want to be more effective.
Here's another question. Do social culture differences have an impact on lockdown effectiveness in the region? Discipline of local society to maintain social distance or stay at home. The writer suggests contrasting Uruguay with Brazil.
People have wanted to find sort of like confirmation of their previous biases in the data. Right? So, you would have to say, well, the lockdowns were very effective in Israel, but they were not effective they haven't been very effective in either Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in Qatar, in Oman. And so you would say, well, Muslim countries it's not very effective. Plus Ramadan happened in May. So that's the reason why, things exploded there. But it just so happened that they were extremely effective in Jordan, Lebanon, and Tunisia, which are also Muslim countries. So I think that these general characteristics don't map so clearly into success. If, for example, Chile had been successful, we would have said, well, of course, Chile, good institutions, good this, good that. But Chile has been a mess. So Uruguay probably benefits in part from being more isolated, probably benefits in part from more social capital. people's attitudes to things like, for example, masks. You know, Bolsonaro has been flaunting masks. Are masks a symbol of social respect, of saying, I, I am showing everybody else that I'm concerned for your health and I want to make sure that I don't infect you. And not wearing a mask is like an act of aggression. So that mental framework obviously would help. That's what explains probably in part East Asia, where not wearing a mask is seen as an act of offense against other people. And so I think masks are probably among the things that are more effective. Social distancing is probably, things that are relatively effective. Minimizing, living outside is probably effective. What we don't know, and it's very important to find out, is how much transmission occurs within the household. Because it may be that, one of the differences is how large is your household. If so suppose that there's a lot of within household infection, then if only 1 in 8 people leave the home, when they come back, if they're infected, they infect 8 other people, it's gonna be a mess. So how large are households? How multi-generational are households? For example, one thing that happened in Italy was that the older people lived with younger people. So the older people tried to protect themselves, but the young had to go to work or go somewhere. When they would come back, they would infect the old people. So it has to do with family structure, household structure, the nature of the transportation system. So we don't know. I think these things are knowable, and it's a pity that they're not really known. We should have the scientific epidemiological effort to find out the truth about these things.
Do you subscribe to the suggestion that I've read in a lot of places that this whole episode has discredited experts?
I think that I've been working, as I said before, I've been working with 12 governments, and this is true about COVID-19, but it's also true in general. When I've had the opportunity to interact with epidemiologists at Harvard, and we've been getting advice from Mark Lipsitch and his group. And Mark Lipsitch is probably the most renowned epidemiologist in the world, or thereabouts. And when you talk to him and you ask questions, he will tell you all the things that he thinks we don't know. We don't know about this disease. It's not that they are unknowable. They may eventually be known, but we haven't had time to do the research to find out some basic things about this disease. So presidents, prime ministers often want you to contact an expert or to give the most learned advice on an aspect of policy. And that knowledge just does not exist in the world because we don't know basic things about the nature of the disease, how it is transmitted, which are the comorbidities that really matter, how mortal is the disease given the comorbidities in your country, and what are the sociodemographic aspects of your country in terms of the structure of households, the structure of your urban transport system, the things like what I mentioned before, the percentage of households that have refrigerators or running water, etc. So these things are not, it's not that there's an expert out there that knows. We need to figure out ourselves how we're going to learn. And there is an attempt, and that has been a little bit of our focus and the focus of other people at Harvard, that instead of asking, what should we do, what is best practice in this context, what we should focus on is rapid learning from your own experience, to see, what things can be figured out in real time as we battle this disease.
Very good. Here's another question. Do you see this pandemic as an opportunity to promote more formalization of economies? In order to receive state aid due to COVID, informal companies should be asked to get a tax ID and individuals need a bank account. Do you see this as an opportunity to formalize the economy?
Probably not. Probably not, because what probably will happen is a huge collapse of formal employment and many people trying to eke a living. And so there's going to be an increased supply of people just trying to find ways of earning a living. And they will, they will offer their services in the best way they can. And that will be registered statistically as an increase in the informal sector. By the way, I don't view the informal sector as really something like flaunting the rules of taxes and so on. It's more, the informal sector is more a failure of the formal sector to grow to the point that they run out of people. And so if the formal sector was more dynamic in Latin America, they would want to hire more people, and they would have to lure people out of the informal sector by offering better working conditions, better wages, more protections, and so on, in the same way as it happened in the US. In the US, 8 out of every 9 workers was a formal worker. In Monterrey, 2 out of every 3 workers is a formal worker. In Chiapas, 1 out of every 7 workers is a formal worker. So informality has a lot to do with the size of the formal economy, with how much this modern, call it capitalist form of organizing production, how much of that has expanded. And my answer to a question was that I think that formal part of the economy is shrinking. And so people will go to their best alternative, which is to try to eke a living in some kind of informal productive capacity. So the informal sector will probably expand.
Okay, Ecuador is already dollarized, so the country cannot print money and inject markets and give social support. What is your recommendation besides multinational lending?
Well, Ecuador is one of the countries I've been talking to. Minister Richard Martinez has put in place a very, very good advisory group. It was led by Augusto de la Torre, who was for a long time the chief economist of the World Bank for Latin America. He's a great economist. I think that they have probably the best possible plan given the constraints. The constraints are huge. It's a country that doesn't have a currency. It doesn't have international reserves. So, okay, so if you don't have a currency, maybe you want to hold a lot of international reserves. Well, they don't. It's a country that, well, if you are dollarized and so on, maybe you need a government that is able to borrow. Their government is unable to borrow. So multilateral assistance is, I think, crucial. It's really crucial. Since they cannot devalue, a devaluation is one quick way to cut down dollar prices and dollar wages in the economy. So it's one way to make yourself more competitive, if you want, by reducing prices and wages measured in US dollars. Well, if you cannot do that through devaluation, maybe you have to do it by cutting wages and cutting prices. And they suspended a law that prevented people from renegotiating wage agreements to lower them, because Constitution and so on, or I don't know exactly the precise legal term in the context of the Ecuadorian legal framework, but essentially a little bit like in Venezuela, all social rights can only improve; they can never go back. Well, in this case, you would have to negotiate some agreement between firms and workers to cut wages so that the firm can survive. And they have moved in that direction. So my advice is to try to give support to to Minister Richard Martinez and his economic team and this economic plan. I think it's well thought out, and I think it's tough. It's not the ideal plan, but I think it's the best that is feasible given the constraints that Ecuador faces, and those constraints are really one more example of how lousy the policies of Correa and Chavez and so on were, that we went through the biggest oil boom in world history, a period in which we should have put more resources for a rainy day. Well, it's now pouring, and it just so happened that not only did we spend all those resources, but we borrowed against them. So I think Ecuador is paying now the disastrous policies of the Correa administration.
Let's turn to another kind of pandemic. The question is, the health crisis caused by the pandemic has exposed many corrupt activities in many countries, especially in government procurement. Businesses and workers are not happy with restrictive measures governments have adopted, such as raising taxes and increasing debt levels, because they fear these fresh emergency resources will be lost in corrupt practices. Has corruption or anti-corruption been included in pandemic recovery economic models?
So I think the government procurement in Latin America, because of concerns of corruption, have become nightmares. So everybody every government official tends to be very, very cautious before signing off into anything. Every time you buy something, you need to have 3 bids. Sometimes, you're going to allocate to one of those 3 bidders. The other 2 are going to protest and accuse people of corruption. In anticipation of that, bureaucrats just don't buy things, don't procure. Peru is apparently running out of oxygen. There's not enough oxygen in Peru given the number of people who are sick. And I can perfectly imagine that concern over corrupt practices and corrupt procurement or eventual accusations of corruption make the bureaucracy work that much more slowly. And so there are going to be pressures to suspend many of those tough procurement rules, with the danger that maybe corruption, some people will behave corruptly, or things will be purchased at prices higher than the prices that would have emerged from a slower, more competitive process. But in my impression, trying to stop corruption by complicating the rules tends to come at the cost of a less effective government. And I have done some research on this topic that I'm going to say it in a techie way, that if you look at say GDP or GDP growth or something like that, and you control for government effectiveness, and you ask, does cutting corruption improve GDP or growth? And the answer is that if you control for government effectiveness, reducing corruption is bad for growth. And the way I explain that logic is that reducing corruption would be good for growth if it is one way of improving government effectiveness. But if you reduce corruption in a way that lowers government effectiveness, you don't get what you want. And in fact, if you reduce corruption in a way that does not enhance government effectiveness, well, the reduction of corruption comes at a cost, and you see it in lower GDP and lower growth. So I want to alert that many people would like to believe that there's a pot of money out there that is costless, that if you just use that pot of money, you can solve this problem without raising taxes. And I want to say that that pot of money, this pot of money that is corruption, and that you just can, if you just stop corruption and you can use that pot of money, it doesn't work that way. The way you stop corruption in today's world is typically a very costly way to stop corruption. It's a way to stop corruption by restricting what bureaucrats can do. And that tends to come at the cost of government effectiveness. Let me answer maybe one more question that hasn't been asked, but it's connected to this one. Governments are going to end this period with levels of debt which are much higher than they had expected, with balance sheets that are much worse than what they had expected. And as a consequence, they will have to do a fiscal adjustment after this crisis in the medium term to make this situation sustainable. And not only will they have to make a fiscal adjustment after this crisis, they will benefit from announcing that fiscal crisis as soon as possible to signal to capital markets that you will be sustainable in the medium term. So you want to tell capital markets, I'm borrowing a lot of money now, but I'll have money in the future to pay you back because I'm doing these things. And I think that worldwide, but especially in Latin America, that fiscal adjustment will have a revenue side. And that revenue side will be based in increased taxation of capital income. In most Latin American countries, the workhorses of taxation are the value-added tax, which is a fairly regressive tax, and taxes on labor income. And capital income is taxed at rates which are much lower than the taxes on labor income. And I think that equilibrium is going to be reversed. It's going to be reversed in the US, it's going to be reversed in many countries in the world, and I think it's going to be reversed in Latin America. We're going to go into a period in which taxation of capital income is going to be going up. And what's going to make it more feasible is the fact that there is now increasingly cooperation between the tax authorities of rich countries to share tax information of what expats in their country, what non-citizens are earning in their country. The US has a law called FATCA. I don't know what it stands for those, but essentially it asks all banks in the world to report to the US government the assets held by their citizens. The OECD is pushing this very strongly. Angel Gurria, the Secretary General, is very proud of saying, he said in Davos this January, that this effort of sharing information has identified 5 million bank accounts holding $5 trillion owned by citizens of one country held in another country. So there's now an increasing level of international cooperation in terms of tax information. So I think Latin America will have to go to global taxation of capital. So you pay on the income you earn anywhere in the world, and they will be able to leverage this tax cooperation across countries that are now sharing tax information.
Very good. You just answered 3 of the questions that I was about to ask you. FATCA is the Foreign Accounts Tax Compliance Act, FATCA. And on corruption, I think you and I ought to have a conversation about this, but that's an entirely different Zoom meeting. Here's a question. What is your opinion about the impact of COVID-19 on international trade, exports, and foreign direct investment? Do you think that Latin American countries could take advantage of companies that want to relocate their operations, reshoring strategies?
Well, we did a study on Baja California, and in the study on Baja California, we developed some friends and contacts and so on. And I just had a conversation with them a few days ago, and they were telling me that they're full of companies that are trying to relocate to Baja California to supply the US market. So as they say, it's no longer just in time, it's now just in case. so I've seen that in Mexico. I haven't seen that, say, in Colombia or in Peru or elsewhere. So I think that Mexico is likely to benefit from that reshoring or nearshoring process, but I'm not so sure that the rest of what it takes is present in South America.
Well, will it be useful, beneficial to have a tax on net wealth, as Colombia has had?
I think that as the world tries to tax capital income, they may find that a minimum tax on wealth may be a good complement. And sort of like the best practice in the world on wealth taxation is probably Switzerland. It's a centuries-old tax in Switzerland, but essentially you can design it as a minimum tax on capital income. So because wealth is much more observable than capital income, and capital income is very easy to restructure. You can, give it away as dividends. You can, buy back stocks and give it back as capital gains instead of dividends. And if there's differential taxation between one form and the other, firms have easy ways to move their profits around or keep them booked somewhere else. Chile, had a zero taxation on retained earnings, and as a consequence, that led to a fund called the FAT, F-A-T in Chile, which had over 100% of GDP. Nothing particularly good came out of it. So in essence, there is increasing evidence that part of the problem of Latin America is that too low taxation of capital income leads to too high taxation of labor income, which is formal labor income, which leads to very high informality. So if we want to get rid of informality, we need to rebalance taxation of capital and formal labor. And maybe a complement of that is taxation of wealth, so that you tax wealth and you take that tax as deductible from your capital income. That might be the structure of a tax regime going forward.
Do you believe that measures like the one taken in Spain, the minimum income system, can be a way to reactivate the economy? What would be the advantages and the limits?
Well, right now, the problem is that governments in Latin America have been much less generous than that and don't have the money to fund it. So I think that, first of all, I think it would be great to be able to compensate those who have lost their employment as much as possible. But these things are going to be limited by the relatively small fiscal space that Latin America has. And as a consequence, when you have less resources, you want to target those resources more. The more fiscal space you have, the more universal you can make things. The less fiscal space you have, the more you want to target. So I think the original sin here is the lack of fiscal space, the lack of financial muscle in the state that are going to restrict the scope of these initiatives.
A question, why is it not feasible for Colombia to take advantage of reshoring strategy from USA companies? This is in direct response to what you commented on.
Well, I think this is a puzzle that we don't really know the answer to. Colombia has done a bunch of things to increase its exports and its non-traditional exports. It signed a free trade agreement with the US that came into effect in 2011. It was sort of like copied from NAFTA. NAFTA came into effect in January 1st, 1994 in Mexico. By the year 2000, exports between Mexico and the US had tripled. And by the year 2007, they had doubled again. So you see, you sign a free trade agreement and supposedly that eliminates some trade barriers and you get explosive export growth. Colombia has signed the same free trade agreement. In 2011, it's been 9 years and you see nothing. There's no export growth to the U.S. It's you have to look in a with a magnifying lens. Colombia thought that it had to do with trade facilitation, with doing business indicators, with adopting OECD standards. They've done all of that. And exports in Colombia remain at $1,000 per capita. They have gone essentially nowhere except for the oil boom and bust. And so that's why I say that I know of no company that has been reshoring towards Colombia. But I've now been asked to chair with the Vice President of Colombia an advisory group for presidential advisory group. It's called Misión de Internacionalización, where we're trying to figure these things out. And we were given 6 months to figure it out. But I must report to you that the standard explanations that I hear, I don't buy. And that I think it must be something deeper about the lack of the kinds of firms in Colombia that can be, or the lack of the kind of entrepreneurship in Colombia that would internationalize the country. And I would leave it at that, but I just document that it hasn't happened. I don't see it happening. It should have happened before. The discussion of participating in global value chains is old. It hasn't happened in Colombia.
Well, is it perhaps an overhang of the fear of violence, which has been endemic in Colombia for 100 years or so?
I mean, I don't know. I worked on Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka grew by leaps and bounds during the Civil War. And so you can always find excuses. The other excuse that's typical in Colombia is that they have 3 mountain chains, and that complicates logistics and so on. But that does not explain why Barranquilla did not take off. So you can always find yourself an excuse that makes you feel better about yourself. But that doesn't solve the problem. The problem is to really understand what's at stake here. And let me give you one example. Before the Venezuelan catastrophe, there was 1 foreigner in Colombia for every 250 people. There were essentially no foreigners in Colombia. Now we know that there are 14% foreigners in the US, but 29% of entrepreneurs are foreign born. And 54% of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley are foreign born. So Colombia has been very disconnected from the world talent market, and it has not really participated in trying to attract talent towards home. And there may be issues of both legal openness and cultural openness to diversity that may have kept the business community a fairly narrow, closed game.
Okay, our final question is not so much a question, it's a PhD thesis on refrigerators in Peru, but it's interesting. The 50% figure is nationwide and 3 years old. In urban areas, it is much higher. 80% of homes in Lima and Callao, almost half the national urban population, have refrigerators, and that represents almost 90% of the people. Homes with larger families are prone to have them, and single or double occupancy homes are more prone to not have them. Rural areas have extremely low penetration of refrigerators, but their family food logistics are self-provisioned in a large extent.
Well, that's great. That's great. I mean, as I said, I learned from Hugo Ñopo's article in the press like a week ago or so. And I find that this is the kind of debate we need to have. Is this a potential explanation for what is happening, or is it not? In any case, what we do know is that mobility towards the workplace has declined enormously in Peru. And we do know that infections are growing exponentially. And all the ideas that we can muster and all the scientific evidence that we can bring forward to identify what are the channels that we can act on are good. So if this is not an effective channel because people already have refrigerators, then okay, fine. I don't understand I think that the numbers in Unguñopo was something like 50%. The numbers in the question don't add to 50%. So because they say 90% of the population is urban and 80% of them have refrigerators. So that means at least 72% have, and the others self-provide. So there's some incompatibility in the facts. I would say first, let's figure out what the facts are. And second, then let's figure out if this is an effective channel to do something about it or not.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of questions that you have not already answered. Ricardo, thank you very much. This is most interesting. I might comment on your comment on the symbolism of masks representing, broadcasting that the person has respect for other people, and not wearing a mask is a symbol, a message of aggressiveness. I'm going to ask the Andean associations to send me a recording of that, because we need it in New York City and a number of other places. It's a very interesting short description of one of the problems that we have, not just in New York, obviously. So Ricardo, thank you very much. I want to also thank our hardworking association team for making this event possible. Executive Secretary Linda Calvet, Director of the Colombian American Association, Lena Delgado, Program Officer Lori Dominguez, and Associate Lisa Marie Wills. We especially thank Lori and Lisa for taking charge of the online logistics for this program so capably. I can say from a lot of Zoom experience that this one worked pretty well. There was no hunting for buttons and lost signals and what have you. Our next event will be a Venezuelan American Association webinar on Wednesday, June 24th, with the State Department Special Representative for Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, whom I will interview on the subject, the United States and Venezuela. If you are interested in this program or would like to become a member of the Andean American Associations, please contact our team via the information on today's invitation. Thank you for all participating. Thank you especially, Ricardo. Go back to your idyllic life in the Berkshires. We will let all of you know again about more webinars and look forward to meeting with you again.